I'm John Law, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the Hyundai Venue. First launched in 2019, in 2021 it's already onto its third revision. So we've got a couple of spec tweaks for this car here, new alloy wheels and some interior goodies as well, which we'll get to in a minute, but the price has also gone up by $500 pretty much across the range. Now that makes the Venue a pretty expensive proposition for a light SUV, and especially if you're upgrading from something like a Hyundai Accent, this car's forebear. So in today's video, we're going to check out if the Venue is still the place to be in the light SUV segment. So, first thing we've got to discuss about the Venue is how it looks, because this is a pretty funky looking light SUV and it's one of its best sort of draw cards really. It's got an interesting face with the classic separated lights that all of these kind of cars are going to these days. This car finished in fiery red looks pretty cool. This Active variant has a little bit more style, a little bit more presence than the base Venue does, which looks a little bit basic in my opinion, so you've really got to go for the Active, and then the Highlander really sets it off with a contrast roof and it looks pretty cool. But you can let me know what you think of the looks of the Venue in the comments section down below, because as I said, I do think it is one of the better looking SUVs in its segment. However, there's a little bit of old tech which we're about to get into in the interior. Now, inside the Venue, unlike the outside, everything is pretty basic in here. So the design is very black heavy. There's not that much to brighten up the interior. This Active does get these nice little pearl white trim inserts here, and there's a little bit of funkiness to the dashboard, a handy little cubby to store your phone here, and there's a little tray down here for putting your phone in as well, which in the upper grade gets wireless charging. But the biggest call card for 2021 is that Hyundai has added wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto to this very crisp 8-inch touchscreen here, which is nice and accessible for the driver. That's a really great thing at this price level and means getting into the car, you don't have to worry about plugging your phone in or anything like that. The only gripe with it is that it still tends to drop out quite regularly. It's not so bad when you're just running music, but when you're running maps as well, it tends to drop out between every 2 to 3 minutes, which is pretty annoying. Apparently there is a fix on the way for that though, so as this car ages, you'll be able to upgrade that and get that sorted out, says Hyundai. There are a couple of other really big annoyances for me in this car. One of those is the fact that none of the window switches are auto down and auto up, which just seems a little bit weird. Surely at least the driver's side could be auto up and down. And the passenger side vanity mirror doesn't have a cover. So if your passenger's got the vanity mirror open and the sun shines in exactly the right spot, you can actually get blinded, and it happened to me during my week of driving. Anyway, back to the good stuff in the Venue. You get a nice creamy steering wheel here covered in leather. You also get leather appointed shifter. It's got multi-functions on the steering wheel and a nice set of analog gauges in front of you with a 4.2-inch TFT readout that shows you all of your fuel consumption, your speed, and allows you to adjust settings for the safety features, which we'll come to in a minute. As for other practicalities, you do now have an armrest for 2021, nice squidgy padding, and it is adjustable. So it does beat the Toyota Yaris Cross in that scenario. And you've also got a little bit of storage under there, 2 cup holders here next to the manual handbrake, which is a little bit cheap in this car. And then we come to the seats, which are appointed in quite a funky fabric. It looks a little bit different. You've got some interest at least inside, though they're very flat and not particularly supportive, especially in the bolstering. But again, it's a light SUV, so you're probably not going to be cornering too hard. The door materials are plastic, very scratchy indeed, but you do at least have this nice little soft leather pad here, and you've got decent sized door bins as well. And the stereo is surprisingly good for such an affordable car. So let's jump into the back seat of the Venue and see how comfortable the rear quarters are. Unfortunately, the Venue doesn't offer much space for 2 6'2" occupants. I mean, that's not hugely surprising given the size of the car. I do have adequate headroom given this car's pretty tall proportions, almost minivan-like. But my legroom is just super compromised behind my own driving position. I have to splay my legs even to get in. I can't actually physically sit with my legs straight behind the front seat. Again, something you kind of expect in a car like this. Tow room is very adequate. Unfortunately, there's not many other amenities back here. You get scratchy door plastics. You do get your soft padding back here on the armrest, which is a little nice touch, and a little door bin big enough for a small bottle. You've got a net behind the passenger seat, and the squab is actually quite comfortable. It's the same sort of funky material that you've got in the front seats to give it a little bit of extra style. Unfortunately, you've got no flip down armrest though, and you've also got no cup holders and no ventilation, no 12-volt sockets or USBs. So it's not going to be really good if you're carrying kids who need their devices charged or anything like that. But for this car's use case, which is going to be chucking a couple of people in the back for short trips, is not the worst place to be. You've also got really good visibility out over the driver's seat because this car is quite tall. So let's jump around the rear of the Venue and see how practical it is. Now, like the front of this car, the rear has a couple of funky styling features. Really, again, played up in the Highlander where you have that contrast roof and the little contrast lip spoiler. You do have coloured in Venue letters, which look good on all cars except for white cars, because the white is slightly different to the actual colour of the car, which is a funny little quirk. Anyway, under the manually operated boot lid, if you want electric operation, you're going to have to go for something like a Skoda Kamiq. Skoda Kamiq also kills this car when it comes to rear end practicality, because this car doesn't really have any nets of any sort. It doesn't have any real shopping bag hooks. There's sort of an attempt at one, but it's not particularly great. At least the space on offer is pretty good. So 355 litres with the boot floor in its lowest configuration. That does bring quite a hefty load lip though. So you can pop the boot floor up into the higher position if you want to minimize the load lip, but obviously that impacts on storage. So that's the boot of the Hyundai Venue. Fairly practical thing, not exactly the most spacious vehicle on the market, but hey, you wouldn't expect that given this car's size. And now we're gonna have some fun and take this Venue out on the road. So, driving the Hyundai Venue out on the road, and unlike the interior, there are no major changes for 2021 in terms of how this car drives. So it's very similar to how it was when it launched a couple of years ago. And that's not to say it's bad. However, there's a bunch of new cars on the market that do reaffirm that this car feels quite cheap to drive. There's nothing about this thing that is particularly advanced, but in a way, there's a lot to be said about simplicity in a vehicle. So let's talk about the engine first, which is this car's probably the most reason that I'd call it a fairly simple vehicle out on the road. So under the bonnet is a 1.6 litre naturally aspirated 4-cylinder engine that kicks out outputs of 90 kilowatts of power and 151 newton meters of torque. They're fine for motivating this car. It's pretty light, it's only about 1200 kilos or thereabouts depending on specification, but it's not a particularly nice engine to drive. It's quite thrashy, makes quite a lot of noise when you're getting up to speed, as you'll hear now. It just feels a little old school, definitely feels like a small 4-cylinder engine used to. Now it's hooked up to a 6-speed automatic gearbox in this particular vehicle, though you can opt for a 6-speed manual, which is quite sweet and works the engine a little bit better in my opinion. We had our long-term test car that was a 6-speed manual, the cheapest Venue you could buy. You can check out that review in the top corner there. But with the auto, it's more accessible for more people, but it's not a particularly good automatic gearbox. The shifts up are quite good, but it seems to have a logic to shift down a little bit more abruptly than perhaps I'd like. But aside from that, it's pretty smooth. Now the Venue is only available in front-wheel drive here in Australia, and it's only available in this engine combination. In India, where this car is actually slightly shorter in the wheelbase and overall length, you can option this car with a 1-litre turbocharged 3-cylinder engine that is found in the Kia Stonic GT line. Now for me, that's something I'd love to see in the Australian market because that engine's got a bit more torque, so 170 newton meters available across a broader range, and that would just keep this car on the boil a little bit better, I reckon. But you can let me know in the comment section down below whether you like the simplicity of this 1.6 litre engine. The other problem with this basic engine is that the fuel consumption isn't particularly good in this Venue. So it's quoted at 7.2 litres per 100 kilometres in the combined cycle here in Australia. Now on our test lip, we actually returned 7.5 litres per 100, which is very close to that claim. But that said, it's not as good as you're going to see in something like a downsized turbocharged engine. So take that into consideration. The chassis of the Venue is actually pretty decent. So on a back road, it's quite an enjoyable car to pilot. The light weight of the vehicle keeps it feeling quite pointy and quite enjoyable, but to be honest, that's not really what the Venue is about. And the reason you might buy an SUV like this is because you want that extra ride travel as well as that more commanding driving position, neither of which this car has in particularly large amounts. It's quite a crashy vehicle. It's a basic chassis, so it's running a McPherson strut front suspension and a torsion beam rear suspension. Not to say that torsion beams are inherently bad, but in this particular application, it's quite thumpy. You can really feel the torsion beam thumping through both wheels into the cabin. Echoes quite a lot in the car. And on the whole, on these 17-inch alloy wheels on this Active, it just feels perhaps a little bit stiffer than what most people are going to be after in this sort of sphere. As you pile on speed, it gets a little bit better, but around town on short stutter, sharp-edged bumps, it's just a little bit on the firm side. That is fixed a little bit on the base Venue, which gets 15-inch alloy wheels now, but I still shouldn't really be having to complain about the ride quality on wheels with this much sidewall, at least in my book. But you can let me know. Now, we've got to talk about the chassis of the Hyundai Venue. And one of the main reasons you might buy a light SUV like this over a Hyundai i30 is the suspension. You'd expect it to ride a little bit better with its longer travel suspension. Unfortunately, that's not really the case. The Hyundai Venue offers a pretty basic rear end setup, so it's a torsion bar suspension system, which isn't inherently bad. However, in this application, it's pretty harsh and it introduces a lot of extra terseness to the ride, especially at low speeds. On sharp-edged bumps, it really thumps through into the cabin, which is a little bit unpleasant in my book. But the ride is better once you get up to speed, so once you're on the freeway, it all settles down pretty well. The extra harshness you get around town isn't so pronounced, and it feels well controlled. There's no lolloping around in the rebound or anything like that. And the chassis is actually quite fun on a back road. Not that that's what this car is for. It's very basic, first car kind of thing. But it is quite enjoyable to drive the Venue with a bit of pace on it. The steering, though, really does erode that. It's very light, which is easy to maneuver around town, but it's got this weird sort of springy feel. And when you've got the brakes on and maneuvering, it gets quite heavy. So yeah, it's a bit of an odd steering system. Onto the MVH, where it's surprisingly well suppressed for such an affordable vehicle. On coarse chip freeways, 100 k's an hour, it's a little bit loud, but nothing untowards. So the Venue is fairly well equipped for this end of the market at least. So you've got AEB with pedestrian and cyclist detection. You've got lane keep assist, which turns on every time you turn on the vehicle. It doesn't work too well at lower speeds, but once you get a bit of pace on, it's fine, does a good job. You don't get adaptive cruise control on any grade though, which is a little bit of a shame, but personally I'm a fan of normal cruise control anyway, so it doesn't bother me hugely. But as a first car buyer who might want to relax and someone who needs a little bit of attention help, it is a nice thing to have on a long road trip. You also don't get any blind spot monitoring until you get into the range-topping Highlander of the Venue range. So that's the Venue. It's a surprisingly endearing little car to drive, but I think it would be just sweetened by bringing that 1-litre turbocharged engine sold elsewhere to this car here in Australia. So, what are our detailed thoughts on the Hyundai Venue? Well, for 2021, that extra little spec and kit bump has made it a more enticing proposition, but the $500 increase in price hasn't really adjusted its value equation. It's still quite a lot of money for the car, but it is cute, funky, and quite endearing to drive, so I kind of quite like it. But you're definitely best to test drive other vehicles that might offer slightly better value than the Venue, including this car's passenger car counterpart, the Hyundai i30. Now you can let me know what you think of that in the comment section down below, whether the Venue's cute and funky styling is enough for you to have bought one or to be seriously considering one, or whether you can see other value propositions that are better on the market. Let me know down below. And while you're down there, we'd love it if you could hit subscribe, the bell icon, and as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.